All right, hi everybody. Welcome back to part two of this export API filters. I had to redo this, sorry. So if you saw a notification that there's a video. Anyway, moving on to the IPC device filter. Again, I found that as I was building out these different APIs, I needed the flexibility to specify the filter directly using the various selectors that are capable for each of the object types, like devices, blocks, so on and so forth. So as the example here, if I were looking for a list of devices that contain a name and logged into my system, I should get an IP list of devices that match those records and the number of rows returned. Okay. Now the idea with this too, and when you're looking at it, if I were to take a look at the devices in a variable, let me just do this. And the dev, let's do interfaces. And one thing to note is when you're looking at the interfaces variable in the exports, that's where the IP address is stored. So in some of these cases, when you're doing the export, I have it listed out that it'll provide the IP address within the custom object. So I'm placing it in on the top level object so you don't have to parse through the interfaces. So just a couple of those little quirky things that I think should help out along the way with your testing. Now the same with the export IP to device resource record. Any IP devices that have like an IP with a device resource record that appears in the device record tab would appear in this export, and then you can, filter out by um, different types of values if you want to do your selects in the PowerShell. So I can then, just as an example for admins, I have this happen often, that there's devices that have A records and they don't manage the PTR. And by doing this, you could tell it to run through a subnet, export all the IPs, export all the resource records, and then compare, is there a PTR and an A record? And if there's not, you could tell it even to update and create it if the reverse zone were there, or flag it for some type of maintenance. So just for those admins that have been looking at this before, and you probably know who you are, that's a good way of using this and that functionality. Now the resource record query, again with the filters, if I want to go out and I want to look by a type and then specify a selector, I can do that. And if I can remember how this goes, I think I can do RR type equals A. No, that's not it. Okay, let's check the filter real quick. We're looking for export device resource record. I guess it doesn't have that there as an option. So we can do this through, say, containers as an example. And let's get the right capital. By the way, this is case sensitive too, so you want to make sure you do this properly with those. So let's do testing this. It still doesn't. Goodness, I think I've got some time here. I need to wake up. So get the username right and get your queries right as well. This is the right syntax here now. One note then, you noticed it kept popping up a password. So because I have an encrypted password, if you, for any reason, fail any lookup or login, it immediately deletes the file, and you're prompted to have to go back through the login again. So make note of that if you're using this, and that happens to you. So make sure you check your logins like I just did. So I think in this other case here, we should also be able to do some things like the UDF fields. So as I mentioned with the child block, the devices themselves that have user-defined fields, if you do a query for it, It's basically a partial query that generates the context that I send to this export command, and it tells you what user-defined fields are applicable or set to a device. And in this particular one, there's only one. But let's say you had assets or contact data, that would be returned as well. Moving on into some of your DHCP, some of the things you are commonly going to look for, at least we do and customers do, is things like option sets and what options are applicable to clients and they want to modify, like a domain or option 252 or something that's going to be for phones, etc. So this gives us a good way to do that query and introspective into the policies of what's set, query for certain options or values, or even look for values. So if I were looking for a specific IP address within the name or IP, I could tell it to look for that or something else. All right, so this is a key to have, and then the output of this is an array of elements that you can then manipulate and look at the various options within the option sets, and those are an array of objects, so you can manipulate those values individually. And there is an import for that as well, and a get. Same thing with our policies. This particular version, it requires a name. So I'm going to, I think, change that so that it's not required and then have it so that you can do like a wildcard search because that's kind of long. So this won't be required or have the ability to export all. All right, so the policies here are applicable to your DHCP, so those options and policies, and then the policies that are defined for how that server functions literally within the environment. So how does it operate and so on. Okay. The next export down is getting into the pools. DHCP pools are filterable by a name. So there's a name concatenated to it, or an IP address is within that pool range or container block, or even the net service. So if I'm looking for the particular server and any of its subnets, I can then do this filter by subnet and show me here. Um, so real easy in on that as well. And then of course, if I want to do an IP address, I think this should work if I do 180. And that falls within this range, and so therefore it gave me back the different ranges from the server. So quick ways of getting to that. And just like everything else, I found that I also needed to do some anding of the fields. So I have a custom filter that follows the selector options. One note to note about the IPC export domains is this is only applicable to IPControl 11. So this is something just for that version moving forward. So don't try this on 10 or 11, you will get an error. But the same thing with this, I allow for all of the selectors to do things like return the domain contains a wildcard and that the name has this, and then it will return whatever we have back from the function. Okay, so I have a lot of domains and things that we can filter on to pull this back. But the idea is that you can then see all the refresh values. And I've done some other scripting with this that you can then go out and query the SOAs, validate what IPControl says to what the servers say, or even say, here's IPControl and here are your servers. Make sure they're all in sync. Useful. The domain resource records, unlike the devices, are records that are stored at the domain level, so only applicable or accessible through the domain. And if we can do a search on one, are stored and without the selector that shows that it's a device. So there's no device checkblock here, and that's probably the only one I have listed out there. So if I go out and tell it to do this from my subnet, I should get basically that one record, right? You can have potentially millions of these, so be careful with your selection. Make sure you have your limiters or filter it down as much as possible. And also because I know that there's some anding in order to help you filter that down to do the custom filters for that. The net services function is really just an export of CSV data explaining the DHCP servers. This is a common format, it looks familiar to others, and that allows us then to look at this through Excel and look at the features. You can also then take that information and use it for the imports to duplicate or clone those. Now, the Extranet network element I use often, which is basically the networks, routers, and switches that we use through discovery. So through SNMP and through other capabilities, SSH for scraping, we can go out and discover the subnets that are attached. And this gives us then the ability to see network elements, filter on things like the name, or look at the agent type or vendor, things like it. So the point of this then is to be able to get a list of these. If you ever need to make global changes to the agent or update information, you can. And so I've included a number of characters, and I was working around with the pipelines, which I'm still finishing, where I included the token and the IP so that it could actually be pipelined into the next command using that same token. But I don't think that's necessary, so I'll probably revise this a little. But just note that that's there. 1 second. All right, and the next exports I have here are effectively based on the approval workflows that are defined in the policies options, very last option. Now I have this right now built for the device workflows, and this I cannot demonstrate in this video. However, what this does is if you enable this for resource records, let's break my policy. I'm going to go ahead and do this. Yep, I can't. So I have to approve those other changes. But effectively, when you have this available, if you turn it on, DNS records, when they're pending approval, meaning someone within the hierarchy who has access and authority can check those records, verify their syntax, and then say, sure, go ahead. Now, the idea is that you don't always want that to happen, and you might want to script that so that you can create the record that tells it to go to a pending approval state and then do something with it before it gets deployed, perhaps exporting it, running some type of log query or et cetera, and then approving the status itself. So the first one is to export that by approvals and to take a look at the different admins that are pending approvals. And then the second part is to actually do the pending action, which is create or reject. So if there's like create or delete or something else, it would tell you what that pending action is, and you can tell it to show you that. And the next export is going to be the root blocks. So when we're dealing with root blocks, we're dealing with networks at the high level. There are not a lot of features and things you can do with a root block once it's defined. You can change things like description or update user-defined fields, or even do errand reporting and some other details. I include it here so that you have an export if you're a provider and you have a number of thousands of blocks. Subnets by UDF, another capability here where I use this in order to go out and automate when I want, say, through some of the workflows. And I have a Node-RED video that actually uses this exact syntax and capability so that I can go out and say, give me the next subnet that has APIs enabled, so a flag that you turn on or off, and that has a VLAN or some other identifier that I can use as a subnet. So for automation, you're typically going to have flags that tell your system these subnets within, and I want an IP, I want it within a specific VLAN ID. So I would go do a query for the VLAN ID, extract the subnets, then perhaps look through the utilization of each subnet to determine which one to provide the IP from. That all can be built into a workflow, which we've done and I've done, but you can also do this through PowerShell and build it through that process. So looking at your automation tools, VMware orchestration, things that use PowerShell, I think this is the way to kind of look and manipulate that. So just some key things here to note. And I'm going to come back with an intermission video just to kind of go through a couple scenarios quickly to show, kind of spark some ideas. So we'll look at that here shortly. So that's what we have with the exports. And having that ability to really get to the data is the key. And so if you're looking at generating reports, we'll have all of the selectors available so you can and or look for descriptions, device types, host names, things like it. I have a lot of other utility programs I built for doing things like MAC address, vendor lookups, and things that you can incorporate into this functionality as well. So keep your eye open, and I want to kind of spark some interest and keep your eye for that intermission video. And I hope this one carries through. So thanks again for joining me in the second half of the video. And we'll pick up again and then move through the gets and imports after this, which will go through a lot of the importing of new data. All right, take care. See you in the next video.